Hello, nice to see everyone. This is Sifu Ed from Ekata Training Center. Um, I'm doing a video today that is a bit more extensive because I think it's a topic that's important. And the topic is why I went back to Christianity. And um, some of you may or may not know that my expertise is in Eastern philosophy, being a martial artist, but also being a professor. My field of study has been in Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. And these have been enormously important in my growth and development. But several years ago, I went back to Christianity. And I want to talk about that in a little bit more depth. And hopefully, maybe some of you will find it useful. So, I grew up Catholic, and I never really had any difficulty with Catholicism. It was just something that I was brought up with, and I always had a belief in God, and I also had a belief in Christ. Um, but I felt somehow that there were missing components. I didn't feel entirely connected to it. In my heart, I felt a truth to it, but there was something that just I felt was missing. As I began the study of martial arts, I began to look into Eastern philosophy, and then I began to study it in school. And I found that the connection with, particularly with Taoism, the connection to nature was tremendously relevant to me. It was something where I felt this very close connection to being in nature. I used to guide canoe trips. I used to, up in Canada, I used to spend enormous amounts of time in the woods in Kentucky where I grew up. And those were the times when I felt the most peace. And with the Eastern philosophy, particularly the Taoism, it's so much about aligning with nature and aligning with natural order in order to be able to find a sense of harmony in one's life. Also in Buddhism, I found the tools in being able to shift the mind state and change perspective so relevant and so important. So in my exploration, I became formally Taoist. I became formally Buddhist. Um, I took the vows of refuge, where one becomes Buddhist. So it's more than just an intellectual study and a curiosity. It's something that I actually embraced and took into my life and lived it and continue to do so. Now, this may be of conflict for some people. This is just my path. And if you have an interest in it, I'm glad I can share it. Several years ago, I began to examine why I felt awkward talking about anything having to do with Christianity. I can go on all day talking about Eastern philosophy, about Taoism, about belonging to a Taoist temple, Yiquan Dao, about my Buddhist roots, studying Zen and Tibetan Buddhism, and practicing all of the above. And I don't feel the slightest twinge or concern when I discuss this with other people. So I began to examine, why is it that I feel so odd? Why do I feel almost embarrassed when I'm talking about Christianity? And I felt like I wanted to connect with that path because, again, part of it, when my teacher, Lama Gyatso, gave me the vows of refuge, before I ever did that, I talked to him and I said, okay, I just want to get something clear. can I do this because I personally believe in God, I personally believe in Jesus, and am I still cool to pursue a Buddhist path? Lama Gyatso, no problem. This very lovely sing-songy voice that he had. So I moved forward. But I had almost a sense of embarrassment. And I don't know if it's because as I was growing up, I was exposed to the evangelical tent worships that used to throw up, in Kentucky, that we used to make fun of. The hypocrisy that I experienced with people who would pray and then go mess around on their wives, and the hypocrisy in the Catholic Church with molestation and pedophilia. I didn't honestly know what it was. And the other thing that I began to recognize is that I never truly actually studied Christianity. I'd never really studied the teachings of Christ the way that I'd studied the teachings of the Buddha or the teachings of the Tao. So I began to explore this, and the way that I explored it initially was I looked around for churches, and it was a wonderful story. I was interested in going to visit Real Life Church here in Valencia, and I was in Kentucky visiting my mom before she passed away, and I was at the mall buying a pair of tennis shoes, and I went up to this fella who was at the till, and he asked for my ID, saw my ID, and he said, "Oh, you're from California. Our pastor just moved out there." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Where is he? What church?" He said, "It's Real Life Church." And I said, "Wow, that's pretty amazing because that's like a stone's throw from my house." And he said, "Oh, you should look him up. His name's Rusty George." So I kind of made a mental note, and this fella, I think his name is Bob Ham, he actually had emailed Rusty before I ever made contact, saying, "Look out for this guy from Kentucky." I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. And so when I came back out to California, I made it a point. I sent him an email, and he said, "Oh yeah, come on over." So I went over to the church, and I started to discuss with him, my experience and how I'd kind of drifted away from Catholicism. He said, "Well, come on in, try it out." And it felt very awkward to me initially. The band and the singing and the hands up and the worship and all that stuff, I felt like, oh man, I felt initially very awkward with that entire process. But I began to study it. A couple of the pastors there, they did not reject me because I said, guys, I'm Buddhist, I'm Taoist, I really embrace these principles. Could we compare notes? Could, perhaps we trade back and forth a little bit of information? And one of the pastors, his name is Jeff Cole, who has moved to another church and moved out of state since then, we spent a lot of time together going through teachings. And then, so I had the opportunity to really in depth begin to study. Now, I'm certainly not a biblical scholar, but it really resonated with me. And what was most resonating was the actual teachings of Jesus. And what are they? The core is that you love God with all of your heart and love one another. Core teachings. I take issue with some of the doctrine. I suppose it's doctrine. I take issue with the stance in some circles on homosexuality. Don't buy it. That God doesn't love everyone equally. But the core teachings, the fundamentals, gosh, it really resonates with me. And I feel that personal connection. And you know, the core of the teaching in Christianity is, of course, the belief in Jesus. And so I guess let me tell you why I believe in this. The core of it is the resurrection. If you buy that he came back from the dead, then you buy into Christianity. When we look at the historical data and the verification of most historical data, how we know it from history, any event that occurred, it's validated through multiple accounts of that event. There were a lot of accounts of these events and multiple eyewitnesses. And you could say, well, you know, they dreamed that up. They tried to validate their case by just placing it all in multiple formats in a way that would be convincing. You could say that. But there was so much cooperation. You take a guy like Lee Strobel, who wrote The Case for Christ. This is an investigative reporter from the Chicago Tribune who was a devout atheist who, in his study, trying to disavow all of this, converted himself. He convinced himself that it was true. But here's probably the biggest thing for me. All of the apostles of Jesus had to have seen something that absolutely changed their lives. And they all died excruciating deaths, tortured. Think about human nature. Would you do that? If you were trying to pull off some story just because it sort of furthered your case, and someone threatened your life and dying an excruciating death, most human beings will renege. They'll go back. They'll say, no, you know what? Okay, no, I'm good. I'll say whatever you want because I don't want to go through that pain. None of these apostles did. None of them recanted. None of them went back. Why? They had to have seen something that just completely changed everything in their life, in their perspective. They saw this guy come back from dead. To me, that's very convincing. Now, that's what separates, for me, Jesus from the other teachers. If you follow that he actually came back from dead, he's the only one who ever accomplished that I know of. So this is why I went back to Christianity and why I continue to do so. And I still embrace all the teachings of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, because I think it's enormously important in the way in which we approach life and living a harmonious life. But I didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I went back to my roots, but just in a different way. So I hope that's useful to somebody, and you might find it interesting. Maybe some of you guys listened all the way through this, and if you did, it is the week of Easter, so I would like to wish everyone a joyous and happy Easter.